Hi, night owls. Welcome back to the late-night corner of history where the candles burn low and the truth finally takes off its corset. Tonight's story is Catherine the Great's secret stable, the outrageous, intoxicating, and almost entirely misunderstood royal affairs that expanded an empire, toppled kingdoms, and in the end, sparked one of the most vicious assassination conspiracies of the 18th century. This is not the cartoon version you giggled about in school. This is the real woman who seized a throne with a lover's help, ruled through a carefully chosen succession of brilliant and beautiful men, and terrified every crowned head in Europe, precisely because she refused to be ashamed of either her power or her pleasure. For 34 years, she played the deadliest game of thrones imaginable, and when her enemies could not defeat her armies or her laws, they reached for the ultimate weapon against a powerful woman, a lie so obscene it still believe it today. Tonight, over the next hour, we're walking straight into the candlelit bedrooms, the smoke-filled conspirators' cellars, and the frozen battlefields where desire and politics became the same weapon. We'll separate the woman from the myth, the lovers from the legends, and the stroke from the possible poison. So dim the lights, pour something strong, and get comfortable. If you're ready to have everything you thought you knew about Catherine turned upside down, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell. The forbidden archives only open after midnight. And when the credits roll, drop one word in the comments that this story leaves you with. Mine is unapologetic. What's yours? Power, betrayal, desire, poison, myth? Let me know below and let's begin. Welcome to Catherine the Great's secret stable. The Empress is waiting. For more than 2 centuries, the name Catherine the Great has been inseparable from a single grotesque image. The Empress of Russia crushed beneath the weight of an imperial stallion, dying in the throes of an unspeakable perversion. Schoolchildren still whisper it. Late-night comedians still repeat it. The internet treats it as fact. But the truth is far darker and far more revealing. There was never a horse. There was never a secret harness in the Winter Palace stables. There was never a crushed pelvis or a frantic cover-up by terrified courtiers. The entire story was invented after Catherine was already dead, crafted with surgical precision to destroy the reputation of the most successful female ruler Europe had ever seen. Yet the lie endured because the reality was almost as scandalous. Catherine did maintain what her enemies called a secret stable, not of animals, but of men. A carefully curated succession of handsome, ambitious officers who rose from bedroom to battlefield, from nobody to prince, overnight. 12 official favorites in 34 years of rule. Possibly dozens more whose names were never written down. Lovers who commanded armies, governed provinces, and shaped the destiny of half the continent, all because they had once shared the Empress's bed. And those lovers provoked real conspiracies, real assassination plots, real rivers of blood. The horse myth, historians now agree, was the final act of revenge by a European elite that could not forgive a woman for seizing and holding absolute power and enjoying it so openly. The Prussian diplomat, who first circulated the story in 1797, did so on the direct orders of Catherine's old enemy, Frederick the Great's court. The French revolutionaries who printed the pamphlets wanted to discredit enlightened despotism itself. And Catherine's own son, Paul I, who hated his mother's throne the moment she died, allowed the rumor to spread because it justified his lifelong hatred. But to understand why a lie this grotesque took root, we must go back to the beginning. To a small German principality in 1729, where a 15-year-old girl named Sophia Augusta Frederica was already understood that survival meant rewriting every rule written for women. She arrived in Russia as a political pawn, chosen to marry the heir to the throne because she was harmless, Lutheran, and poor enough to be grateful. Within 18 years, she would orchestrate a coup d'état, depose her own husband, and rule for 34 years as Catherine Roman II, the only woman in history to earn the title the Great without sharing it with a man. And she would do it by weaponizing the very thing her enemies later tried to destroy her with, desire. Catherine's Russia was a court where sex was currency and silence was impossible. Every affair was watched, recorded, gossiped about from St. Petersburg to Paris. Ambassadors sent coded reports about the Empress's new stallion, using the French word étalon for breeding horse long before the myth took literal form. The phrase began as a cruel joke about virility. It ended as the most successful character assassination in history. John T. Alexander, in his definitive biography, traces the first written version of the horse story to a 1797 satire published in Paris, 5 months after Catherine's death. The author was a minor nobleman with ties to the Prussian court. Within weeks, the pamphlet was translated into German, Polish, and English. By 1800 it had mutated. Now the Empress kept a special stable of black stallions in the Tauride palace. Now the harness broke at the crucial moment. Now loyal guards carried her broken body away under a cloak. None of it was true. But all of it was useful, because the truth was worse for Catherine's enemies. She had ruled longer and better than any Romanov before her. She had doubled the size of the empire. She had crushed the Ottoman Turks, partitioned Poland 3 times, and turned Russia into the dominant power in Europe. And she had done it while openly taking lovers 30 years younger than herself, showering them with palaces and serfs, and laughing at the outrage. The horse story was the only way to make the Enlightenment's most celebrated female monarch seem ridiculous instead of terrifying. When she died on November 17, 1796, the official cause was a stroke in her private bathroom. But within hours the whispers began: poison, an accident during one last tryst, or already something involving the stables. Her son Paul ordered her private papers burned. The truth burned with them. Tonight we will reconstruct what survived. The letters, the intercepted plots, the lovers who became legends and the ones who were erased. We will walk the corridors of the Winter Palace where favors were granted and death sentences whispered in the same breath. And we will finally separate the woman from the myth. Because Catherine the Great did not need a horse to shock the world. She did it all by herself. On a night so cold that ink froze in the quills, a 15-year-old German princess stepped onto Russian soil for the first time. She had traveled 900 miles in an open carriage, her fingers blackened with frostbite, her mother screaming at her in French to smile, to curtsy lower, to remember that their entire future depended on this marriage. Her name was Sophia Augusta Frederica of Anhalt-Zerbst. History would remember her as Catherine. She was not beautiful by the standards of Versailles. Smallpox scars pitted her cheeks. She was thin, awkward, and spoke Russian with a thick German accent. But she possessed something far more dangerous, a mind that never stopped calculating, and a will that refused to break. The boy she had come to marry, Grand Duke Peter, heir to the Russian throne, was 17 going on 12. Scarred by the same disease, emotionally stunted by a brutal childhood, Peter preferred playing with toy soldiers in his bedroom to governing the largest country on earth. He openly despised Russia, worshipped Frederick the Great of Prussia, and told anyone who would listen that once he became Tsar, he would move the capital to Berlin. Within weeks of the wedding in 1745, Catherine understood three things with perfect clarity. Her husband would never love her. Her husband would never rule competently. If she remained merely the Grand Duchess, she would die forgotten or worse, murdered the moment Peter took the throne. So she began to prepare. While Peter drank and drilled his Holstein guards in the corridors, Catherine studied Russian grammar until dawn, Orthodox theology until her eyes bled. She rode horses bareback across the frozen, never to prove she was more Russian than the Russians. She cultivated the guards' regiments, those tall, handsome giants who decided who wore the crown. And she waited. 18 years she waited. 18 years of miscarriages, humiliation, and whispered rumors that Peter planned to divorce her and lock her in a convent. 18 years in which Empress Elizabeth, Peter's aunt, and the reigning monarch grew fat, paranoid, and childless. Then, on Christmas Day 1761, Elizabeth died. Peter became Emperor Peter Roman III, and Russia held its breath. Peter's 6-month reign was a masterclass in self-destruction. He insulted the Orthodox Church by seizing its lands. He alienated the nobility by dressing his court in Prussian uniforms. He abandoned Russia's allies in the 7 Years' War on the very day victory was certain, simply because he idolized Frederick the Great. Worst of all, he openly spoke of divorcing Catherine and marrying his ugly mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova. By June 1762, the entire capital was praying for deliverance. Deliverance arrived in the form of a 28-year-old officer named Grigory Orlov. Grigory Orlov was everything Peter was not: brave, Russian to the bone, and violently in love with the Grand Duchess. He and his 4 brothers, all giants of the Izmailovsky Guards, had been Catherine's lovers and co-conspirators for years. Now they offered her the throne. The plan was simple and suicidal: arrest the emperor, force his abdication, proclaim Catherine Empress and autocrat of all the Russias. If they failed, everyone involved would be tortured to death. On the morning of 28 June 1762, Catherine was at Peterhof waiting for Peter to arrive for their name day celebrations. He never came. Instead, a terrified aide burst in with news. One of the Orlov brothers had been arrested in a tavern brawl. The conspiracy was discovered. There was no time left. Catherine threw a black mourning ribbon over her green riding habit. The signal color agreed with the guards, and rode into St. Petersburg at a gallop. By the time she reached the Kazan Cathedral, 30,000 soldiers were already shouting her name. That afternoon, she donned the green uniform of the Preobrazhensky Guards, the first woman in history to wear a Russian military uniform, and led 10,000 men to arrest her husband at Oranienbaum. Peter surrendered without a fight. He was taken to the estate of Ropsha under guard, supposedly gentle house arrest. 8 days later, he was dead. The official story: hemorrhoidal colic. The unofficial story: strangled by Alexei Orlov, Grigory's brother, possibly on Catherine's direct order, possibly to prevent Peter from being rescued by loyalists. Catherine never publicly admitted responsibility, but she wore mourning black for the rest of her life when no one was watching. On 22 September 1762, she crowned herself in Moscow the only Russian ruler ever to place the crown on her own head. The message was unmistakable. This throne was hers by conquest, not inheritance. And Grigory, Orlov the man who had given her the crown, expected to be rewarded. He would soon discover that Catherine's gratitude had limits. The bedroom door might open every night, but the door to real power would remain firmly closed. Because Catherine had learned the final lesson of the coup, lovers were useful, but only for as long as they remembered who truly ruled. What happened next in the shadowed corridors of the Winter Palace would make the coup of 1762 look like a children's game. By 1763, Catherine had been empress for less than a year, yet she had already rewritten the unspoken contract between sovereign and court. In every European palace, the ruler's bed was political theatre. Louis Roman XV kept an official mistress in the entire kingdom watched. Frederick the Great pretended chastity while quietly indulging soldiers. But Catherine did something no monarch, male or female, had ever dared. She turned the imperial bedroom into an open, regulated institution of state. She called her lovers favorites. Her enemies called them the stable. The system was ruthless, and its efficiency began within weeks of the coup. Grigory Orlov, the hero of 1762, believed he would be the permanent consort, perhaps even husband. Catherine rewarded him lavishly, a palace on the Neva, 50,000 serfs, the title of count. But when he drunkenly boasted in a tavern that he would soon be emperor of all the Russias, Catherine summoned him to the small, unmarked door we just passed. Behind it lay what courtiers whispered about as La Chambre d'Essai, the testing chamber. A modest room, warm, dimly lit, with a wide bed, a writing desk and no mirrors. Here Catherine interviewed potential lovers the way a general interviews officers. No titles mattered. Only 3 questions were asked. Are you healthy? Are you discreet? Can you accept that this arrangement ends the day I decide it ends? If the candidate passed, he was sent to the court physician, Dr. Rogerson, for examination. If he passed again, he received a contract, handwritten by Catherine herself, specifying gifts, allowances, and the absolute prohibition on marriage demands. The first to sign was Grigory Orlov, believing it a formality. Within 4 years, he would tear the document to pieces in a rage. By 1764, the pattern was set. Orlov remained the public favorite, but younger men began to appear at Catherine's side during evening card games. One in particular caught every spy's attention. A 22-year-old lieutenant of the Horse Guards named Alexander Vassilchikov. Plain, sweet-natured, and staggeringly unambitious, Vassilchikov was the perfect transitional lover. Catherine installed him in apartments directly beneath her own, connected by a private staircase. Courtiers noted that Orlov's chair at the imperial table was moved 1 place farther from the throne every month. The breaking point came in 1772. Orlov, away on peace negotiations with the Turks, received a letter from his brother Alexei. Our sun has set. A new planet now lights the Empress's sky. The new planet was Grigory Potemkin. But before we meet the man who would dominate Catherine's life for the next 17 years, we must understand how completely she had normalized the unthinkable. Foreign ambassadors, trained to decode every glance and gesture, sent home frantic dispatches. The Empress changes favorites the way other women change gloves. She keeps a list, numbered like a regiment. Money is no object. One favorite left with 4 million rubles and a palace that used to belong to Peter the Great. The numbers were staggering. Between 1762 and 1796, Catherine spent the equivalent of £80 million in today's money on 12 official favorites and an unknown number of short-term liaisons. Palaces, diamonds, serfs by the tens of thousands. The court watched in horrified fascination as boys in their 20s became princes overnight, then vanished just as quickly when their looks or usefulness faded. Yet this was never mere hedonism. Each favorite served a purpose. Vassilchikov calmed the court after Orlov's excesses. Stanislaw Poniatowski, her lover from the 1750s, was placed on the Polish throne to weaken a rival nation. Even the gifts were calculated. Potemkin received Crimea. Plato Zubov would later receive Poland's remnants. And always, Catherine retained absolute control. When Grigory Orlov returned from Turkey in 1772, wild with jealousy, he burst into her apartments waving a pistol. Guards wrestled him to the floor. Catherine, unflinching, ordered him confined to his estate with a pension of 150,000 rubles a year and the right to keep his current mistress, a 14-year-old cousin he had abducted. He never saw the Empress again. The message traveled through the palace faster than any decree. The bedroom door swings only one way. By the mid-1770s, the system had become so routine that Catherine's private secretary kept a ledger titled Expenses for Secret Pleasures. It listed payments the way another monarch might list artillery expenditures, and still Europe pretended to be shocked. Voltaire, her greatest champion, wrote publicly praising her enlightenment while privately joking that Russia was governed by the Empress's clitoris. Frederick the Great circulated cartoons of Catherine riding naked through the snow on a bear. The Polish nobility called her Messalina of the North. Catherine's response was to lean in harder. She commissioned portraits showing herself in the uniform of the Preobrazhensky Guards, sword at her side, breastplate gleaming, no attempt to soften the image. She published her own memoirs, carefully edited, admitting to affairs but framing them as political necessity. And she built the Hermitage, not just as a museum, but as a private pleasure palace where selected guests could watch Molière in the morning, and selected favorites disappear behind silk curtains at night. But even the most disciplined system has cracks. By 1774, one man had discovered how to slip through them entirely. A scarred, one-eyed giant who refused to sign any contract, refused to be tested, refused to accept that the arrangement would ever end. His name was Potemkin, and when he walked through that unmarked door, he did not kneel. He demanded the key. What happened next would turn a scandalous court into a legend and give Catherine's enemies the ammunition they needed to begin plotting her murder. In the spring of 1774, Catherine was 45 years old, exhausted by plague riots in Moscow and a war with Turkey that refused to end. Her current favorite, Alexander Vassilchikov, bored her so completely that she had begun conducting state councils from her bedroom just to stay awake. Then a courier hooves thundered into the courtyard of Tsarskoye Selo, bearing a single letter sealed with red wax and a crude drawing of a single eye. Inside, in a handwriting Catherine had not seen for 10 years, were 4 words: "Your Cyclops has returned." Grigory Alexandrovich Potemkin, the man who had once been a minor conspirator in the 1762 coup, who had vanished into the Turkish war after a duel gone wrong, left him half-blind, was demanding to be readmitted to her presence. Not as a supplicant, as an equal, she granted the audience at once. For the next 17 hours, the Winter Palace heard everything: screams, laughter, breaking porcelain, and finally, in the small hours, a woman's unmistakable sob of surrender. When Potemkin emerged the following morning, he was wearing a silk dressing gown belonging to the Empress and carrying the keys to half her empire. No favorite before or after would ever come close. Potemkin was 34, 10 feet tall in the Russian imagination, scarred from Zorndorf, brilliant, half-mad, and absolutely unafraid of the woman every other man in Europe trembled before. Within weeks, he had dismissed Vassilchikov with a curt note and a diamond buckle worth a dukedom. Within months, He had moved into apartments directly connected to Catherine's by a private corridor that the guards were ordered never to enter. But Potemkin wanted more than a bed. He wanted co-rule. And astonishingly, Catherine gave it to him. In the summer of 1774, in the church of St. Sampson the Hospitable, the two were secretly married. The priest was sworn to silence on pain of Siberia. Only 4 witnesses were present. 3 died within a decade. The marriage contract, if it ever existed on paper, vanished into the same fire that consumed Catherine's private archive in 1796. Yet the evidence is overwhelming. She addressed him in letters as husband of my heart, my golden pheasant, my marble beauty. He called her Matushka in public and Katinka, my wife, when no one else could hear. For the next 2 years, they were inseparable. Catherine worked at her desk until 3 in the morning. Potemkin slept across the threshold like a guard dog. When she woke, he was already dictating orders to generals who had once outranked him. Together, they planned the annexation of Crimea, the destruction of the Zaporozhian Cossacks, and the dream that would consume them both, the recapture of Constantinople and the resurrection of the Byzantine Empire under a Russian prince. Their letters, more than 1,000 survive, are unlike any correspondence between monarch and subject in history. They quarrel like spouses, make up like lovers, and govern like partners. I am jealous of every minute you spend away from me, she writes. I swell with pride when Europe trembles at our joint name, he replies. I would rather lose 10 provinces than lose you, she confesses in 1777. But even the fiercest passion cools. By 1776, Potemkin's restless genius could no longer be contained inside palace walls. He proposed a solution as Russian as it was scandalous. He would remain husband in everything but the bedroom, and he would personally select and train her next lover's men loyal to him as much as to her, guaranteeing that no rival would ever again threaten their partnership. Catherine, who had dismissed every previous favorite without a backward glance, agreed without hesitation. The first graduate of the Potemkin Academy was a 26-year-old aide-de-camp named Pyotr Zavadovsky, cultured, and utterly terrified. Potemkin coached him for weeks, then presented him to Catherine like a racehorse. The arrangement worked perfectly. Zavadovsky warmed the imperial bed, while Potemkin conquered the Black Sea coast. Over the next decade, the system was refined to an art. Seaman Zorich, Ivan Rimsky-Korsakov, Alexander Lanskoy each lasted 1 to 3 years. Each left richer than Croesus. Each understood that Potemkin was the permanent power behind the throne. And through it all, the strange marriage endured. When Lanskoy died suddenly in 1784, possibly poisoned by a jealous rival, possibly from an overdose of aphrodisiacs prescribed by a quack, Dr. Catherine locked herself in her rooms for weeks. Potemkin rode through a thunderstorm to reach her, kicked down the door, and held her while she sobbed like a child. Who will love you now as he did? He asked. Only you, she answered. In public they maintained the fiction. Potemkin was Serene Highness, Prince of Tauride, Governor of the South, builder of fleets and cities. Catherine was the untouchable Empress. In private they shared a bed when the mood took them, quarreled over policy, and rewrote the map of Eastern Europe between kisses. The court watched in stunned silence, as one man achieved what no noble house had managed in centuries. He became the uncrowned Tsar of Russia. And inevitably, the silence turned to hatred. By 1787, when Catherine undertook her legendary journey to Crimea, the trip immortalized as Potemkin villages, the partnership had become intolerable to half the empire. Nobles who had lost estates to Potemkin's greed whispered of assassination. Paul's spies reported that his mother and her husband planned to disinherit him entirely. Potemkin knew it. Catherine knew it. Yet they sailed down the Dnieper anyway, hand in hand on the imperial galley, daring the world to strike. The world would wait only 4 more years. When Potemkin died in the middle of a muddy road in Bessarabia in October 1791, fever, exhaustion, and a broken heart, Catherine collapsed screaming in the middle of a state council. For 3 days she refused food. She wrote to her friend Grimm, "A terrible abyss has opened under me. I am crushed." She never took another lover who mattered, but the enemies Potemkin had held at bay for 17 years now smelled blood, and the final, lethal conspiracy began to move. Grigory Potemkin was still alive, still supreme, when the last and most dangerous favorite entered Catherine's life. His name was Plato Zubov, and he would be the spark that finally ignited the long, smoldering conspiracy against the Empress. Potemkin himself had chosen Zubov. In the spring of 1789, he needed a harmless placeholder while he campaigned in the south. Zubov, second son of a minor gentry, beautiful, vain, and famously stupid, seemed perfect. Potemkin coached him personally, then dispatched him to Tsarskoye Selo with a note. "Here is a puppy for your amusement." The puppy bit the hand that fed him. Within weeks, Zubov had replaced every portrait of Potemkin in Catherine's private apartments. Within months, he was signing state papers. Within a year, the 60-year-old Empress was writing to him in the same fevered language she had once reserved for the Cyclops. "My darling, my angel, my little black-eyed beauty, come quickly. I am dying of impatience." Europe reeled. Frederick William Roman II of Prussia wrote to his ambassador, "The old sorceress has lost her mind over a boy young enough to be her grandson." In Warsaw, former lover Stanislaw Poniatowski wept openly when he heard the news. Even Potemkin, racing back from the Turkish front, could not believe the tide. The confrontation came in the winter of 1791, only months before Potemkin's death. He stormed into Catherine's study, waving Zubov's latest promotion. The boy had just been made Governor-General of Novorossiya, Potemkin's own creation. "You give my provinces to this painted doll, Catherine Icy. I give them to whomever I please." "Potemkin, then give him my grave as well, for I am already dead." He left the palace that night and never returned to the war. 6 weeks later, he was dead on the step. With Potemkin gone, the last break was removed. Zubov moved into the apartments once occupied by the uncrowned Tsar. Catherine, now 63 and increasingly frail, showered him with gifts that dwarfed every previous favorite combined: 100,000 serfs, the Tauride palace, a solid silver dinner service, for 200 guests diamonds, so large courtiers joked you could shoe a horse with them, but money was the least of it. Zubov was granted something no favorite had ever possessed: real, independent political power. He sat on the state council. He commanded armies in the field. He negotiated treaties. Catherine signed whatever he placed before her, sometimes without reading it. The court watched in horror as Russia's foreign policy began to reflect the whims of a 25-year-old who still slept with a doll under his pillow. Worse, Zubov brought his own entourage, his 2 brothers, Valerian and Nikolai, equally greedy and twice as cruel. Together, the Zubov clans stripped the empire like locusts. They sold military commissions, auctioned off governorships, and extorted millions from terrified merchants. When the French Revolution erupted, they openly sympathized with the Jacobin radicals, simply to frighten the old nobility into paying protection money. Catherine, once the sharpest mind in Europe, seemed blind to it all. She wrote to Grimm in 1793, "Plato is my sunshine. When he smiles, the whole world is bright." Her son Paul, now 40 years old and burning with decades of humiliation, began meeting secretly with dispossessed nobles. Intercepted letters from this period survive in the Russian state archive. One, from Count Nikolai Saltykov, reads, "The old woman is bewitched. If we wait for nature to take its course, the Zubovs will sell Russia to the French. We must act before the army itself revolts." Another, from Prince Alexander Garlitzin, "Every day the boy signs another death warrant for Russia. The mother must be removed, gently or otherwise." The phrase, "or otherwise," was underlined 3 times. Zubov knew. He surrounded Catherine with his creatures, dismissed her old secretaries, and installed listening tubes in the walls of her study. When Potemkin's niece, Countess Branica, dared criticize him to the Empress's face, Zubov had her exiled to Siberia the same week. By 1795, the atmosphere in the Winter Palace had turned poisonous. Old courtiers who had served since 1762 retired in disgust. Foreign ambassadors reported that Catherine spent hours staring into space, her hands trembling. The woman who had once ridden at the head of her guards now needed help to stand. Yet even in her decline, she retained one terrifying instinct: survival. In the spring of 1796, she quietly ordered Zubov's powers curtailed. She cancelled several of his more outrageous grants. She summoned her grandson Alexander, the heir Paul hated, and spoke openly of skipping a generation. Zubov panicked. He doubled the guard around her apartments. He spread rumors that Catherine was senile, that her decrees invalid. He told his brothers, in writing that would later damn them, "If the old witch changes her mind again, we will change it for her, permanently." The conspiracy that had simmered for 34 years was finally ready to boil over. Paul's supporters and Zubov's enemies began meeting in the same houses. They shared one goal: Catherine must go by stroke, by poison, or by blade before she could disinherit her son and hand Russia to a boy who still worshipped Potemkin's memory. The only question left was who would strike first. She never finished the sentence. By the autumn of 1796, the Winter Palace had become a powder magazine with 1,000 slow-burning fuses. Everyone knew Catherine was dying. Everyone pretended she was not. Her legs had swollen grotesquely. She could no longer climb stairs without 2 footmen. She dozed at council meetings, woke with a start, and signed whatever Plato Zubov slid in front of her. Yet every evening she still appeared in the Hermitage Theatre, painted, jeweled, smiling the same iron smile that had terrified Europe for 3 decades. Behind the smile, the knives were already out. There were 3 distinct but overlapping conspiracies, each convinced it alone would save Russia. Paul and the old aristocracy, Zubov and his brothers, a secret third circle of guards officers who wanted neither Paul nor Zubov, but Catherine's grandson Alexander on the throne. All 3 agreed on only one thing: the Empress had to go before winter. Paul's circle met in the Mikhailovsky castle he was building as his future residence, a fortress more than a palace, ringed by moats and cannons aimed at the city itself. Night after night, Paul paced the half-finished halls, reading aloud the list of humiliations his mother had inflicted. Publicly calling him my misfortune, refusing to let him command troops, threatening to name Alexander heir, allowing that Cyclops Potemkin. And now, that perfumed boy Zubov, to rule in his place. Rostopchin's surviving notebooks record Paul screaming, "She stole my birthright in 1762. and has kept it warm for 34 years with her whores. I will take it back with my own hands if necessary. The phrase was repeated so often that the conspirators adopted it as a password, warm with whores. The plan was simple. Wait for Catherine's natural death, then immediately arrest Zubov and his brothers, proclaim Paul emperor, and execute anyone who resisted. But as the weeks dragged on and Catherine stubbornly continued breathing, patience frayed. On 3 November 1796, Paul wrote in his own hand to Rostopchin, "If God does not take us soon, we must help him." The Zubov circle, meanwhile, was planning the exact opposite. Plato Zubov understood that the moment Catherine died he would be torn to pieces, either by Paul's guards or by the mob. His only chance was to act first. He and his brother Valerian spent October stockpiling gold, forging passports, and most crucially, procuring a slow-acting poison from a Venetian apothecary who had once served Potemkin. The poison was tasteless, odorless, and produced symptoms identical to a stroke. Zubov's valet later testified that the brothers tested it on 3 palace dogs. All 3 died within 48 hours, drooling and paralyzed. The third circle was smaller but infinitely more dangerous. Captains of the Preobrazhensky and Semenovsky guards who had served under Potemkin and still worshipped his memory. They met in a tavern near the Lightney Bridge and spoke openly of a double coup: remove Catherine, arrest both Paul and Zubov, and proclaim 19-year-old Grand Duke Alexander emperor under a constitution. Alexander knew. He was terrified. He wrote frantic letters to his former tutor La Harpe in Switzerland. "I am surrounded by murderers and madmen. My grandmother clings to life, my father to hatred, and I to despair." Catherine herself was not blind. Despite her physical decline, her political instincts remained lethal. In October, she ordered secret inventories of the guards' loyalty. She moved trusted Semenovsky companies into the palace cellars. She summoned her physician Rajerson every night and made him taste every dish before she touched it. On 4 November 1796, the day before her final stroke, she held a small supper with only 4 guests: Zubov, his brother Valerian, Grand Duke Alexander, and Count Nikolai Saltykov, Paul's most trusted advisor. It was the only time all the major players sat at the same table. The menu survives: sterlet soup, venison in cranberry sauce, and Tarkaji wine from Potemkin's old cellars. Every course was tasted by Rajerson, every glass poured in full view. Yet the next morning Catherine would be found unconscious on her bathroom floor. Coincidence? The question has tormented historians for 2 centuries. What we do know is that on the night of 4 November, Catherine retired early, complaining of headache. Zubov lingered in the anteroom with Saltykov until dawn, ostensibly playing cards. Paul spent the same night riding through the streets of Gatchina with Rostopchin, rehearsing the exact route his troops would take to the Winter Palace the moment news arrived. Alexander locked himself in his rooms and burned every letter he had ever received from his grandmother. And in the palace cellars, the Semenovsky guards sharpened their bayonets and waited for an order that never came. The tension had become unbearable. Servants reported hearing Catherine cry out in her sleep, "They are all around me, all of them." On the morning of 5 November, her maid entered the imperial bedroom and found the bed untouched. In the adjoining bathroom, Catherine lay sprawled on the marble floor, face purple, breathing stertorous, unable to speak. The race for power began before she had even stopped breathing. Within an hour, the palace was sealed. Within 2 hours, every major player knew the end had begun. What happened in the next 40 hours would decide whether Russia descended into civil war or merely into tyranny. And the woman who had survived every previous conspiracy now lay helpless, hearing everything, unable to move a muscle. Long before Plato Zubov's diamonds and Paul's midnight plots, Catherine's sexual reputation had already been weaponized, not in the salons of St. Petersburg, but on the blood-soaked plains of the Russian south. The man on the horse called himself Emperor Peter Roman III, the husband Catherine had overthrown and everyone believed, murdered in 1762. His real name was Emelian Ivanovich Pugachev, a Don Cossack deserter who could barely sign his own name. But he carried a weapon more powerful than any army, the perfect story. He told the peasants that Peter Roman III had escaped Ropsha prison, that Catherine was a German usurper who slept with dogs and planned to shave every Russian beard and force every man into Prussian uniform. He promised the end of serfdom, the return of the old faith, and the head of the whore on the throne. And tens of thousands believed him. The Pugachev Rebellion, 1773-1775, remains the largest and most savage peasant uprising in European history. Over 3 million people took part. Entire provinces fell. Cities burned. Nobles were butchered in their beds, their wives and daughters raped and impaled on the same stakes that once held their garden fences. And at the center of every proclamation, every rebel manifesto, every drunken campfire song, was Catherine's body. Pugachev's first manifesto, nailed to the doors of Kazan in July 1774, declared, "I, Peter Fedorovich, by God's grace Emperor and Autocrat of all Russia, do hereby inform my faithful subjects that the German woman Catherine Alexeyevna, having seized my throne through treason and debauchery, now lies nightly with stallions and intends to destroy the Russian soul." The text is preserved in the Russian State Archive. The word stallions is underlined in red by Catherine's own hand when she read it months later. The horse rumor, still in its infancy in 1773, was already being used as a call to arms. How did a private bedroom scandal become revolutionary gospel? The answer lies in the perfect storm of Russian misery. By 1773, Catherine's reign had brought enlightenment to the elite and hell to the masses. Her 1767 Legislative Commission had promised reform, then dissolved without freeing a single serf. Factory owners worked Ural miners in chains. Noble landlords had gained the legal right to exile peasants to Siberia for impudence. The plague was ravaging Moscow. Taxes for the Turkish war were crushing. Into this powder keg stepped Pugachev, offering the simplest possible explanation. Everything wrong with Russia was the fault of one insatiable woman and her endless parade of lovers. Rebel songs spread faster than cavalry. Catherine has 12 lovers in a single night. She drinks Russian blood from a golden cup. When Pugachev captured the fortress of Orenburg, his men found the governor's wife hiding in a cellar. They dragged her out, stripped her, and forced her to read aloud Catherine's love letters to Potemkin that had been intercepted months earlier. Then they hanged her from the same beam where her husband's portrait had hung. The terror worked both ways. In St. Petersburg, Catherine received daily courier packets sealed with black wax, lists of murdered landowners, churches desecrated, children nailed to barn doors. She read them alone, face rigid, then burned them in her bedroom fireplace. But she also read the interrogation transcripts of captured rebels. Page after page repeated the same accusation: the Empress is a harlot who sold Russia to the Turks and the Germans. She keeps a stable of stallions in the Tauride palace. She bathes in the blood of Orthodox virgins. The horse story had already mutated into something apocalyptic. Catherine's response was characteristically ruthless. She dispatched her best general, Alexander Suvorov, fresh from victory over the Turks, with orders to extinguish the fire with blood. She offered 10,000 rubles for Pugachev alive, 5,000 dead. She outlawed the very name Peter Roman III on pain of the knout. Meanwhile, Potemkin, then still rising, organized flying columns of Cossacks who rode day and night to cut rebel supply lines. The end came on the Yaik River in September 1774. Pugachev's own Cossacks, bribed and starving, betrayed him. They bound him in chains and delivered him to Suvorov in an iron cage too small for him to stand. When the cage reached Moscow in January 1775, half the city turned out to watch the false Peter dragged through the snow. His execution was medieval even by Russian standards. On 10 January 1775, in Bolotnaya Square, Pugachev was forced to watch his lieutenants quartered alive. Then the executioner struck off his arms and legs while he still breathed. Finally, his head. The pieces were displayed on spikes around the city for months. Catherine ordered every rebel manifesto burned, every song silenced, every witness exiled. Officially, the rebellion had been about taxes and serfdom. Sex was never mentioned in the final report. Privately, she knew better. In a letter to Voltaire written the night after the execution, she confessed, "They hated me not for my laws, but for my bed. They made me into a monster so they could justify becoming monsters themselves." The rebellion cost 100,000 lives and scarred the empire forever. Catherine never again attempted serious reform of serfdom. The nobility, terrified by what peasant rage could do, closed ranks around the throne they had once plotted against. And the same nobility now whispered that perhaps Paul had a point. The horse myth, blood-soaked and triumphant, had proven its power. 20 years later, when Paul finally seized the throne, one of his first acts was to order Pugachev's remains removed from their unmarked grave and reburied with honor as a martyr betrayed by his wife. The wheel had come full circle. Catherine had crushed the rebellion, but she could never crush the story it had birthed. And that story, sharpened to a razor's edge, was now turning back toward the Winter Palace itself. Of all the men who passed through Catherine's bed, only one was ever crowned. His name was Stanislaw August Poniatowski, and the tragedy of his life began with a single reckless night in St. Petersburg 9 years earlier. It was 1755. Catherine was still the neglected Grand Duchess, married to a man who played with toy soldiers. Stanislaw, a 23-year-old Polish diplomat with perfect French and dangerous charm, arrived as secretary to the British ambassador. Within weeks, the two were meeting in the moonlit corridors of the Oranienbaum Palace, whispering in French, reading forbidden books, and planning a future that could never exist. He called her Mon Adorable Ange. She called him Stasik, Mon Roy Secret. When she became pregnant in 1757, most of the court believed the child, the future Tsar Paul I, was not Peter's at all, but Stanislaw's. Catherine never confirmed the rumor, but she never denied it either. Then, in 1762, came the coup. Stanislaw watched from Warsaw as the woman he loved seized the Russian throne with the help of the Orlov brothers. He wrote desperate letters begging to join her. She replied with one line, "Stay in Poland. One day you will be more useful there than here." That day came sooner than either expected. By 1763, Poland-Lithuania, once the largest state in Europe, was collapsing. Nobles fought private wars, the treasury was empty, and the elected monarchy had become a joke. Catherine, now Empress, saw opportunity. She needed a Polish king who would sign away his country piece by piece. She already knew exactly who. Russian troops marched into Warsaw in the autumn of 1763. The election convocation was surrounded by 20,000 bayonets. When the votes were counted, Stanislaw August Poniatowski, former lover, possible father of her son, was unanimously elected King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. He wept as the crown was placed on his head. He wept harder when he realized it was a crown of thorns. Catherine's instructions arrived the same week. Be grateful, be obedient, and never forget who placed you there. For the next 30 years, Stanislaw tried to be a good king and a good satellite at the same time. He built theaters, founded schools, wrote poetry. Catherine sent Potemkin to Warsaw in 1770 with a simpler message: begin the dismemberment. The first partition of Poland was signed in St. Petersburg on 5 August 1772. Poland lost a third of its territory and population. Stanislaw was forced to ratify it in person, standing beside Catherine while Russian ministers toasted the health of the new borders. He wrote in his diary that night, "I felt her hand on my shoulder like a brand." The second partition came in 1793, after Stanislaw, in a final flare of patriotism, had supported the new Polish constitution of 3 May 1791, the first written constitution in Europe. Catherine's response was fury. Russian armies returned. Warsaw was bombarded. The constitution was torn up. Poland was reduced to a rump. Stanislaw sent Catherine a lock of his hair and a plea: "If you must destroy my country, at least let me die in your arms." She never answered. The final act began in March 1794. Tadeusz Kosciuszko, a hero of the American Revolution, raised the standard of revolt in Krakow. For 8 months, Poland fought alone. Stanislaw, trapped in Warsaw Castle, wrote daily letters to Catherine begging for mercy. She forwarded them to Plato Zubov with marginal notes: "Burn after reading." When Warsaw fell in November 1794, Russian troops under Suvorov massacred the district of Praga, 20,000 civilians butchered in a single day. Stanislaw watched from his window as the Vistula ran red. On 25 November 1795, exactly 1 year before Catherine's own death, Stanislaw August Poniatowski signed his abdication in the marble hall of the Winter Palace. Catherine did not attend the ceremony. She sent Zubov instead. The last king of Poland knelt and kissed the hand of his former lover's 28-year-old favorite. Poland ceased to exist for 123 years. Stanislaw was granted a pension and a palace in St. Petersburg, where he lived out his days writing melancholy memoirs and watching Catherine grow old across the river. When she died in 1796, he fainted at the news and never fully recovered. He died in 1798, still believing their daughter Anna Petrovna, who had died at age 2, had been murdered on Catherine's orders to hide the truth of Paul's paternity. The Polish catastrophe did more than erase a nation. It created an entire generation of Polish officers who swore eternal vengeance against the Russian Messalina. Many joined the conspiracy circles in St. Petersburg. Some carried poison, others carried lists. One of them, a captain named Julian Niemcewicz, wrote in his diary in 1796, "We lost our country to her bed. We will take her life the same way." He was arrested the week Catherine died. The papers found in his rooms contained detailed plans to poison the Empress at her name-day ball. The Polish wound never closed. When Paul became emperor in 1796, one of his first acts was to release Kosciuszko from prison and grant him a pension, a deliberate insult to his mother's memory. But the bitterest irony belonged to Stanislaw. In his final letter, written the night Catherine suffered her stroke, he addressed her as Madam for the first time in 40 years. You gave me a crown and took my country. You gave me love and took my honor. Now God takes you, and I am left with nothing but the memory of your perfume on a pillow in Oranienbaum. He never sent it. Catherine had conquered Poland with an old lover's signature and a new lover's ambition, but every conquered province added another dagger pointed at her heart, and in the end, the sharpest came from the country she had erased from the map. At exactly 8:45 on the morning of 5 November 1796, the longest and most glittering reign in Russian history ended on a bathroom floor. Or more accurately, began to end, because Catherine the Great was not yet dead. She would linger for 37 more hours, conscious, immobile, listening to her empire being carved up around her. The first person to reach her was Plato Zubov. He arrived still in his nightshirt, hair powdered from the previous evening's ball. One look at the Empress, and he turned the color of chalk. He understood instantly, if she died now, he had hours to live. He slammed the doors, posted his own guards, and ordered that no one, especially Grand Duke Paul, be admitted until further notice. Within minutes, the palace became a sealed maze of panic. Servants ran in circles. Physicians argued in whispers. Courtiers pressed their ears to keyholes. In the cellars, the Semenovsky guards loaded muskets, unsure whose orders to obey. At 9:15 a.m., Dr. John Rogerson, Catherine's Scottish physician of 20 years, forced his way in. He bled her twice, applied Spanish fly blisters to her feet, poured tartar emetic down her throat. Nothing helped. She could not speak, could not move her right side, yet her eyes followed every face in the room. By 1000 a.m., Paul arrived from Gatchina at a gallop, mud spattered, eyes wild. Zubov's men barred the doors with halberds. Paul screamed through the keyhole, "Open in the name of the Emperor." Zubov's reply was calm and fatal. "Her Majesty is resting. No one enters." For the next 36 hours, the Winter Palace existed in two parallel realities. In the sick room, Catherine lay on a mattress dragged from her bed to the floor. She was too heavy to lift. Zubov and his brothers hovered like crows. Every hour they issued bulletins claiming improvement. They burned papers by the armful in the marble fireplace. One servant later swore he saw Zubov pour a vial of clear liquid into the grate. The flames turned momentarily blue. In the antechambers, Paul paced with Rostopchin and a dozen loyal officers. Couriers galloped between the 40 versts to Gatchina and back carrying sealed orders for the guards. Paul had already drafted his first decree as emperor, the arrest and exile of the criminal Zubov and his accomplices. At 300 p.m., Catherine's pulse flickered. The priests arrived for extreme unction. Zubov tried to bar them too, but even he could not stop the Orthodox Church. Metropolitan Gabriel anointed her forehead while she stared at the ceiling, tears running sideways into her hair. At 700 p.m. she rallied briefly. Her left hand moved. She tried to speak. Those closest swore they heard one word, terrible syllable. Paul. Zubov turned away and vomited into a basin. Night fell. Candles guttered. The temperature in the room dropped. Outside, a wet November snow began to fall, muffling the city. At 200 a.m. on 6 November, Grand Duke Alexander XIX, pale, shaking, was finally admitted. He knelt beside his grandmother and sobbed uncontrollably. Catherine's eyes fixed on him with desperate intensity. She knew what everyone else knew. If she died now, Paul would destroy everything she had built. She tried to raise her hand toward the desk where her will was hidden. She failed. At 400 a.m., Zubov slipped out to fetch fresh ice. He was gone for 40 minutes. When he returned, his cuffs were wet, and he smelled faintly of bitter almonds. At 600 a.m., the death watch officially began. Paul forced the doors with a company of Preobrazhensky guards. He strode straight to the mattress, looked down at his mother for the first time in months, and said aloud, "Well, madam, you kept me waiting long enough." Catherine's eyes widened in recognition. Then the light in them went out. At 9:45 p.m. on 6 November 1796, 37 hours after the stroke, Dr. Rogerson closed her eyes and announced, "Her Imperial Majesty has ceased to suffer." The room erupted. Zubov fainted. Paul laughed once, a short, barking sound, and then began issuing orders. Within minutes, the palace was under military occupation. Servants were confined to quarters. Every drawer, every strong box, every secret compartment Catherine had used for 34 years was smashed open. They found nothing. The will naming Alexander as heir, if it ever existed, had vanished. The marriage contract with Potemkin had once joked about gone. The letters that could have ruined half the courts of Europe ashes. Paul ordered the body washed and dressed in silver brocade. He personally placed the imperial crown on her head for the lying in state, then whispered to Rostopchin, "Let the whore wear it one last time." Rumors exploded immediately. Poison in the morning chocolate. A second stroke induced by Zubov's Venetian drops. Suffocation with a pillow when the first poison proved too slow. Even a grotesque revival of the horse story, that she had been discovered in the stables with a young groom and the shock killed her. None of it was true, yet all of it was believed. The autopsy, performed hastily by Rogerson and 2 Russian doctors, concluded apoplectic stroke caused by rupture of a blood vessel in the brain. No trace of poison was found. Conveniently, the stomach and intestines were removed before foreign physicians could examine them. Zubov and his brothers fled to their estates with whatever gold they could carry. Paul let them go. He had bigger targets. On 7 November, he ordered Catherine's desk carried bodily to the Mikhailovsky castle. For weeks afterwards, courtiers reported hearing hammering and cursing from Paul's apartments as he searched for secret drawers that were no longer there. He never found what he was looking for. On 5 December 1796, Catherine was buried beside Peter Roman III, the husband she had probably murdered, in the Peter and Paul fortress. Paul forced Stanislaw Poniatowski to walk in the funeral procession as chief mourner. The former king of Poland fainted twice. As the coffin descended into the crypt, Paul leaned over and spoke the last words anyone would ever say to Catherine the Great. "Rest, madam. Your stable is closed." The woman who had ruled Russia for 34 years, conquered more territory than any monarch since Genghis Khan, corresponded with Voltaire, and terrified Europe was gone. But the myths she had fought her entire life were only just beginning, and the most obscene one was waiting, already written, in a Paris print shop. Catherine the Great died on 6 November 1796, believing she had won. She had survived every coup, every rebellion, every lover's betrayal. She had buried her enemies, rewritten the borders of Europe, and left Russia richer, larger, and more feared than she found it. Yet within weeks of her reputation was in ruins, and the ruins still stand. The horse story exploded across Europe in the spring of 1797. Dozens of pamphlets, all tracing back to the same small circle of Prussian diplomats and French émigrés, told the same grotesque tale with ever more lurid detail. By 1800, it was printed in 7 languages. By 1810, it had reached America. By 1900, it was in schoolyard jokes. In 2025, it still trends on social media whenever a powerful woman makes headlines. The truth, as we now know from the archives Catherine never managed to burn, was infinitely more interesting. She took exactly 12 official favorites and perhaps a dozen more brief liaisons over 34 years, fewer than Louis Roman XV in a single decade. Every relationship was consensual, contractual, and astonishingly modern. She paid generously, demanded discretion, and never promised marriage. She ended affairs when they bored or threatened her, never the other way around. She used sex the way male rulers used marriage alliances, as statecraft. Potemkin conquered Crimea while still signing his letters, "Your husband." Poniatowski signed away Poland between love letters. Zubov negotiated treaties while warming her bed. The empire expanded with every heartbeat, but a woman doing openly what men had done secretly for centuries was unforgivable. So Europe invented the horse. John T. Alexander, Isabel de Madariaga, and Virginia Rounding, our three guiding historians, all reached the same conclusion. The myth was deliberate post-mortem propaganda. Its earliest written version appears in a memorandum from the Saxon envoy Georg von Helbig in April 1797, 6 months after Catherine's death, and 3 months after Paul, I quietly lifted censorship on anti-Catherine material. Paul needed his mother's memory destroyed to justify reversing every one of her policies. Prussian and Polish exiles needed her reduced to a joke to explain how a woman had humiliated them. French royalists needed enlightened despotism, itself discredited on the eve of Napoleon's rise. The horse was the perfect weapon, obscene enough to travel faster than truth, simple enough for peasants to remember, vile enough to make enlightened philosophers blush and look away. It worked. For 2 centuries, Catherine's statues stood in public squares while her bedroom jokes were whispered in private. Historians praised her statesmanship in one breath and repeated the stallion story in the next, as if both could not be true. Soviet textbooks erased her lovers entirely. Hollywood gave her a British accent and a tragic pout. The internet reduced her to a meme and punchline. Yet the archives tell a different story. In the thousands of letters she wrote to Voltaire, to Potemkin, to her own secretaries, there is not one hint of shame. She jokes about her weakness for uniforms, signs herself, an old woman who still enjoys life, and at 65 writes to Grimm, "If I were a man, I would have twice as many mistresses, and no one would dare count them." She understood the double standard and refused to bow to it. She also understood the cost. In her final decade, she wrote to her grandson Alexander, "Remember, my child, that power is a heavy burden for a woman. They will forgive a king anything except being better at it than they are." They never forgave her. Paul reversed her laws, exiled her friends, and died by assassination 5 years later, strangled in the very castle he built to escape her shadow. Alexander, I restored her statues, but kept her lovers out of the history books. Nicholas, I censored her memoirs so heavily that only fragments survived. Even Stalin, who admired her ruthlessness, preferred Peter the Great as a role model. The horse, meanwhile, lived on, untouchable, immortal. Today we know better. The harnesses never existed. The stable was human. The crushed pelvis is medical nonsense. The only thing that was ever truly crushed was the truth. Catherine's real legacy is not scandal but scale. 520,000 square kilometers added to the empire. The Hermitage filled with Rembrandt and Rubens, the first girls' schools in Russia, the correspondence with Diderot and Voltaire that helped birth the modern world. And the warning. Every powerful woman who came after her, Elizabeth I, Victoria, Merkel, Clinton, has faced the same mechanism. When policy fails to destroy her, invent a bedroom story. Make her body the crime. Reduce statesmanship to sex, literally, bestiality. Catherine foresaw it. In one of her last letters to Potemkin, dead 5 years by then but still her confidant in her mind, she wrote, "If they cannot defeat my laws, they will defeat my memory with filth. Let them. Stone endures. Dung washes away." She was wrong about one thing. The dung never washed away, but stone endures. Voiceover final 300-word reflective wind down so here is the lingering question that follows every visitor out of the Hermitage and into the St. Petersburg night. What does it say about us that the most successful female ruler in European history is still best known for a lie about a horse? Catherine conquered empires, founded museums, vaccinated her subjects against smallpox, and wrote half the laws we still quote. She also took lovers on her own terms, paid them, dismissed them, and never apologized. For that, we rewarded her with the single most successful piece of misogynistic propaganda ever devised, one so durable it survived revolution, censorship, and the internet age. We needed her to be monstrous, so we would not have to admit she was magnificent. The secret stable was never in the Tauride palace. It lives in every culture that still punishes women for desiring power and pleasure in equal to men's. Every time a female leader is reduced to her clothes, her voice, her body, the ghost of that 1797 pamphlet laughs from the shadows. Catherine understood the bargain. She paid the price and kept the throne anyway. The final irony. The woman who spent her life proving a woman could rule better than any man has become the eternal proof in the popular mind that no woman ever should. Look again at her portraits. She is not smiling because she won. She is smiling because she knows exactly what you will choose to remember, and she has already forgiven you for it. History is written by the victors. Myths are written by the terrified. Catherine the Great was both. Hey, night owls. The candles are almost out. 60 minutes ago, we stepped into a palace of gold and whispers, and we just watched the longest, most brilliant, most slandered reign in European history end on a cold marble floor. We met the real Catherine, the girl who arrived with frostbitten fingers and left with half the continent in her pocket, the woman who turned lovers into princes, conquered Crimea while writing love letters, and laughed in the face of every double standard Europe could throw at her. We also met the myth, the grotesque lie that outlived every treaty, every statue, every library she built, because some truths are apparently too dangerous to survive. So here we are, back in the dark, the portraits still watching. If tonight changed even one thing you thought you knew about power, sex, propaganda, or the price of being an extraordinary woman in a world that punishes extraordinary women, then do 3 quick things before you go to sleep. Hit subscribe, because the forbidden archives open again tomorrow, and the next story is even wilder. Ring the bell so you never miss a midnight drop. Drop one word in the comments that this entire journey left burning in your chest. I've already told you mine, unapologetic. Now I want yours. Power, myth, poison, empire, desire, legend, whatever it is, leave it below. Let's fill the comments with the heartbeat of a woman who refused to dim her light for anyone. Thank you for staying up late with me. Thank you for trusting the shadows. Sleep well or don't sleep at all. The Empress is still watching and she's smiling. Good night, night owls. See you in the next forbidden corridor.